welcome back to Troubleshooting Agile. Hi there, Jeffrey.
Hi, Squirrel.
And Happy New Year as well. And we get to start the new year with a dip into the mailbag. We really like getting feedback from listeners. We say that at the end of every episode, and we really mean it. And we got some fascinating feedback from a listener named Tom. He wrote us lengthy and detailed arguments, which we think he's confused about. But we think he's confused in a really interesting way and a really natural way at the stage of vibe coding, which is the topic Tom was responding to, at the stage of vibe coding that our industry is at. So, Jeffrey, did you want to summarize what Tom responded to in our interview, our three-part interview with Gene Kim?
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually received two mails from Tom, and would love to have a third. He responded to both part one and part two, and would love to get his thoughts on part three. So, Tom, if you're listening, would like those further thoughts as well as any response to this. We actually want to start with the part two feedback first, and then we can go to part one afterwards. In part two, Tom said he talked about, he focused in on something that story that Gene talked about a tech executive at a business who went to a team about a new project. They said it would take 6 months, so he went off and vibe coded it by himself in 5 days. And then
Oh
the
my
team
God, he
didn't want
did
to
it in
maintain the
5 days.
project.
How astonishing.
Yeah, only a junior was interested in maintaining it. And Tom points out, like, I've heard lots of stories like this. And the thing is, and Tom points out here, Tom sees this as an admission of fault by the management. You know, the management should see that this kind of response from their team is a sign of their leadership failings. And he focuses here on the fact that if something says 6 months for anything, then that's probably a sign that you've failed as tech leadership. That if you had proper incremental delivery, elephant carpaccio, daily demos, that kind of thing, you would never get that kind of response. So if you are getting that response, it's your fault as a leader. And the proper answer is not to bypass your team and go vibe code something. You should be tackling the core problems. So further, Tom says it's not surprising that it was only the junior who was the only one to volunteer, because in Tom's view, they're unaware of the politics and incentives that led to these kind of dynamics in the team. So that was Tom's response to the second part, was that story, which I think
And I think
there's a lot in
that's
there.
fair. Yeah, there's a lot in there, and I think it's fair to respond if you take Gene's story as illustrating that point, that perhaps it's a great idea to go around your team and vibe code stuff and then ask them to maintain it. That isn't, I think, what Gene meant. It's certainly not what you and I, Jeffrey, think, and this is where I think the confusion comes in. But it's confusion of a really interesting kind. I think Gene is welcome to correct us, as is Tom or Jeffrey right now. It seems to me that Gene's point was junior people tend to adopt these things more quickly. And I'd agree with that because they have less to unlearn. And I don't think he was making the point necessarily that this was a great way that we should all emulate, and every one of us should stop writing code and have business people vibe code everything. What do you think, Jeffrey?
Yeah, I think that's right. And what I was maybe for me this is a bit of a curse of knowledge. What I heard into it was Steve Yeagy's earlier paper from last year on the revenge of the junior developer. And
Steve, of
for
course, being Gene's co-author on the vibe coding book. So it's not surprising that Gene would be making this point. Keep going.
Yeah, and at least what I read into it is, Steve Yegi had written two papers. He'd first written The Death of the Junior Developer, because he was saying about how AI extended the power of a seasoned developer so much. But not only that, but he also highlighted the fact that it would make suggestions that only a senior developer would realize were terrible. Uh, so he predicted that, that the initially, Steve predicted that AI would be super helpful for senior people, but junior people would be finding it unable to use because it would essentially they would be picking a bunch of core problems up that they lacked the context and knowledge to avoid. Whereas the senior people wouldn't have that. But his follow-up was that actually turned out senior people often were resisting the tools, and the junior people were gaining the experience and knowledge of how to work with them, and would have, in relatively short order, leave the senior people behind. Um, uh, that doesn't mean the teething pains that Steve talked about in the first part don't go away, but rather that we will learn both as individuals and as an industry how to get around them, how to shore up the weaknesses and failings of of the tooling. And the juniors who are embedding themselves early on be the ones who are going to be um, at the frontier and learning how to advance it. Um,
So that was, I think, what Gene was trying to say, and that I think is valid, and I'm not sure Tom would necessarily disagree. I don't think that was what Tom focused on. But what was really interesting is that Tom focused on that. And
yeah,
one thing that is really noticeable is that when new ideas come in, like the internet, people tend to adopt everything that goes with it. And they say, those other people over there, they're getting great results by setting up credit card payments on their website and having chatbots and this other thing and the other thing. They set up everything. And it turns out the real insight is you can take credit card payments over the internet. And once you can do that, everything else flows. But people don't know that when you start. I remember that from 1999. Nobody really knew what this website was going to. They thought everything was going to be static websites, right? It wasn't
right.
clear that it was going to be dynamic websites on which you could buy stuff that was going to really revolutionize the industry. I wonder what you think about that, Jeffrey. What have you seen that's the similar kind of confusion at this early stage?
Yeah, and I think the experience I have, if I think about kind of big shifts I've seen, the ones that come to mind for me around the same kind of 1999 period were two things. One was the sort of agile software development coming in. Well, I guess there's the internet. You mentioned that. I guess I should say three. There's the internet. That was like the ocean I was swimming in, so maybe I was not thinking about that as much. So there's the rise of internet applications, application development. Second was the rise of Agile, and third was the rise of open source software.
Mm.
For me, these were all happening at about the same time period, and there was kind of a connection between them. And there was a lot of excitement about all of these, maybe not universal for everyone, but even something like Agile, where when some of the early information came out of it, to me, there's a lot of similarity to the stories about vibe coding. Because what would happen, these Agile, they'd say like, oh, we actually had, what had been a multi-hundred person project for X number of years failed, and then we had this small team of 8 people go do it, create it in 6 months, um, which feels at the time, which felt at the time as unlikely as this kind of story of the tech executive doing what a team said would take 6 months and doing it in 5 days. It felt
And as unsustainable, because people would say, hang on a
yes,
second, they did it in 8 days, but they hadn't handled any of the regulatory requirements. They didn't make it accessible to blind people. They didn't do these other seven things that we have the 400 people for. And we need those 400
yeah,
people. They actually have 400 different sets of skills we need. And your way only works for 8 people. So, you go build your 8 people things, and that's okay. You have fun. But it's never going to work for us. Now, we happen to know that a lot of those
yeah,
tools actually scale up really well if you do it right. Nobody knew how to do it right yet. And so
yes, exactly.
I don't mind at all that Tom has heard one message and Gene meant a different message and we're all a little bit confused. That's normal for this stage. But Jeffrey, how did we get out of that stage?
Yeah, and here I want to bring in, and we'll put a link in the show notes to a model that Chris Matz talks about, which is a community of needs versus a community of solutions. And the in this article, Chris talks about how technologies are adopted. So he uses crossing the chasm model explicitly, and he talks about how in the early days there's high uncertainty, and then later, as the uncertainty diminishes, then things are ready to cross over in the mainstream. But we're very much in those early days where you have people who have needs they're trying to solve and they're having some success. And then you have other groups of people who are trying to generalize those things. to find the combination of things that work in new contexts. And there's a it's so the kind of confusion that we're talking about is not an individual confusion, but it's more like an industry confusion, as people are not yet sure what are the path of things that work in all those contexts. So in like in the case of Agile, when people said, oh, but it could never work on this type of project, they were probably wrong. But it would have been more accurate to say, we don't yet know how to make it work on this kind of project.
To be
um,
fair, we don't know whether it ever will.
yeah.
Static websites are kind of useful, but really the way of the world is dynamic things that change and that respond to you, and that you're using an application essentially over the web. But that wasn't clear at all, and lots of people were making wonderful GeoCities pages with lots of blinking tags and things on them, right? And we're all very excited about it. And some skeptics like Tom were saying, hang on, this isn't going to scale. This doesn't make any sense. You can't use anything. You can't get dynamic queries. This is useless. And they were right. But it was because they were generalizing, and all of us were generalizing something we didn't understand. In the Agile context, people started to generalize things like everybody on the team has to gather together to discuss every ticket. Well, that doesn't scale to 400 people, and it's pretty obvious that it doesn't. But you can split
Yeah.
yourselves up into smaller teams that collaborate and function better, and we know how to do that now, but we didn't then. We were just barely hanging on by our fingernails, figuring out that maybe if we talked to users, we would get better results.
Well, and then the question was, well, in the original XP project, those users were internal to the company. But how would
Exactly.
we possibly talk to people who are outside the company? That just seemed like, how could that ever happen? In particular, how could we have developers, ever talk to users like this? That just felt like crazy talk. But yeah, as you say, we've learned how to get past that, and we're not there yet. But at still time, I'd say it is very exciting, and I think there's an area where people who are visionary and it can extend, can think ahead, can say with some confidence, we're quite likely to overcome many of these problems. Now, at the same time, you can say we haven't yet overcome them. So then there's the question, as a listener or as someone at a company, how do you decide? Should we be diving headfirst into this vibe coding stuff? Is That's I think a legitimate question, and this is why I come back to the crossing the chasm model, because one thing it says is that there are different reasons to change, and there's trade-offs between them. So it's should you be looking at vibe coding now as a function partially of your psychology and needs? Um, do you have a absolutely vital problem that vibe coding is a potential solution for? Then maybe. But on the other hand, maybe you can take Tom's advice, focus on some of the basics of how we know to do things well in Agile software, work on your incremental delivery, your quality, your testing, your elephant carpaccio, get good at the existing best practices, and maybe that puts you in a better position to adopt vibe coding in 6 months or a year, when as an industry we're going to know a lot better how to solve these problems. Not to mention the models will probably be better. That's the kind of the bitter lesson. With our all of our, it turns out this more compute ends up being a bigger, a better solution than a lot of clever algorithm work.
For a long time, one of the best ways to scale your internet application was just to wait 6 months until bigger machines came out, so that the same database could serve twice as fast, and
Yeah,
all the tuning in the
Moore's
world.
law was on your
Yeah,
side.
exactly. We don't have quite that level of growth anymore, but there are other factors at work here that may help us get better results if we do what Tom is absolutely right in saying, which is, hey, let's get our basic practices right. I like that very much. So, Jeffrey, I wonder what you think. Tom had 2 points to make to us, and I know that we were thinking of doing a somewhat shorter episode next time. What do you think about picking this up in a brief piece of feedback to Tom's first point next week?
I like it. Yeah, definitely come back, and because I think he's got um, he also had a valid observation that I think fits well into what we described. So we'll come back. We'll have part two about part one.
Excellent. Sounds good. Very meta. Perfect. So if you want to be meta like Tom and make comments on the comments that we're making and all the wonderful ideas that we're exploring, you can do that at agileconversations.com. That's where Tom went. And he found our email addresses as well as free stuff like our book. And well, the book isn't free, but all kinds of material that supports the book, Agile Conversations, and lots of other very helpful material, all of which is free and which we offer to you because we like to give back and to hear from you, just as we heard from Tom. That includes, of course, if you disagree with us or Tom or both, because we like lots of disagreement here on on Troubleshooting Agile. So if the other way, of course, to keep in touch is come back for part 2, which is actually part 1 of Tom's feedback, and that'll be next week on our next episode of Troubleshooting Agile. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Squirrel.